Thank you for joining Wars of the Rosies as we continue with Part 6, the origin and structure of the York and Scottish Rites and their relations, from the Story of Freemasonry by W.G. Sibley. The origin and structure of the York and Scottish Rites and their relations. As now constituted, Freemasonry consists of two separate series of degrees which are conferred in regular order upon candidates, and are known respectively as the York Rite and the Scottish Rite, both having their foundation the first 3 degrees. The York Rite derives its name from the city of York in the north of England, where McCoy, a Masonic author of repute, says the annual and general assemblies of the craft were re-established in 928 AD. It includes, in addition to the symbolic degrees, capitular, cryptic, and chivalric grades, conferred in bodies severally designed as the chapter, council, and commandery, whose meetings are called respectively convocations, assemblies, and conclaves. The chapter has 4 degrees: Mark Master, Past Master, Most Excellent Master, and the Royal Arch, with an honorary order of High Priesthood appended, which is conferred at meetings of grand chapters on High Priest of subordinate chapters. The chief officers of a chapter are the High Priest, King, Scribe, and Captain of the Host, who represent Joshua, Zerubbabel, Haggai, and the general of the troops. The council has 2 grades, Royal Master and Select Master, its leading officers being Thrice Illustrious Master, his deputy, and the principal conductor of the work, who represent Solomon, king of Israel, Hiram, king of Tyre, and Hiram Abith. The commandery has 3 orders: Knight of the Red Cross, Knight Templar, and Knight of Malta. Its most important officers are the Eminent Commander, Generalissimo, Captain General, and Excellent Prelate. Symbolic Masonry was introduced into America by the British, and during the colonial period of the country was under English authority. After the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the question of allegiance became a serious one to American Masons, but they concluded that Masonic must be in accordance with civil government, and in 1777 chose their own Grand Master to take the place of the British officer. In 1776, a charter was granted to a military lodge in the Connecticut line called American Union Lodge, erected in Roxbury, or wherever its body might remove on the continent of America. At the close of the Revolutionary War, the master and a number of the members of this lodge, of which George Washington was a member, settled at Marietta, Ohio. They had the charter and reorganized the lodge there in 1790, 2 years after the settlement of that historic city. In 1816, the original charter having been lost by fire, the lodge was granted a new one by the Grand Lodge of Ohio under the name of American Union Lodge No. 1. Their new charter, showing it to be a revival of the old lodge, undoubtedly the first one established under American authority. The first authentic historical record of the communication of the Royal Arch degree is dated 1746. When presiding masters and past masters received it in a lodge in England. 22 years later, it came under the authority of a higher body than the lodge, and appeared in Philadelphia in 1758, and in Boston 40 years later. A Grand Royal Arch chapter of the Northern States of America was formed of chapters existing in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New York early in 1798. Which at a subsequent convocation held the same year changed its name to the General Grand Chapter, with a number of deputy grand chapters under its authority. The council degrees came to America from Berlin, by authority of Frederick II, King of Persia, in 1783, and were deposited in the archives of the Grand Council of Princes of Jerusalem at Charleston, South Carolina. They were known at that time as detached degrees and were conferred free of charge. Generally, the authority and jurisdiction over the degrees came into the hands of the companions upon whom it had been conferred. Until 1827, a committee was appointed by the Grand Chapter to investigate the propriety of having the several Grand Royal Arch chapters assume jurisdiction over them. This committee found them to have originally belonged to the Scottish Rite as side degrees, which were conferred by agents of that rite who granted charters for the establishment of councils in different states. These councils finally formed Grand Councils, which threw off allegiance to the Scottish Rite, which was proper inasmuch as their original charters were never granted directly by the Supreme Council of that rite, but only by representatives. They are now placed exactly where they belong, as necessary for the illustration of the Royal Arch degree, and no conflict of authority over them is likely ever to arise. For many years, commanderies of Knights Templar were regarded as having descended directly from the Christian Crusaders of the 12th and 14th centuries. Addison, a leading American Masonic authority, dates the origin of the order back to 1113 AD, when 9 knights who had nobly acquitted themselves at the Battle of Jerusalem formed a holy brotherhood in arms, the purpose of which was to protect and guide pilgrims on their way to the holy city. They were so poor they rode 2 on 1 horse, and had no fixed place of habitation until they were given quarters in the enclosure of the temple by Baldwin II, King of Jerusalem, 5 years after taking the vows of their order. By the end of the 12th century, they numbered 30,000 and had commanderies in Jerusalem, Tripoli, Antioch, Cyrus, Portugal, Castile and Leon, Aragon, France, England, Ireland, Germany, Sicily, and Italy. 100 years later, they had accumulated much treasure, which excited the cupidity of both kings and churchmen. The Grand Master of the Knights Templar, James de Maillet, went to Paris at the request of the Pope in 1307 with 60 knights, bearing 150,000 florins of gold and all the silver 12 horses could carry. His purpose being to concert plans for the recovery of the Holy Land. All were arrested by King Philip, who was determined to have their wealth, accused of spitting and trampling on the cross, worshipping idols and the devil in the form of a cat, and eating the ashes of dead comrades, and of terrible debaucheries. They were put to the torture. 59 Knights Templar were buried at the stake in one day by the Dominican friars. De Maillet was imprisoned for years, tortured repeatedly, and burned to death by a slow fire, March 18, 1313, on a small island in Seine. But modern research has thrown much doubt on Addison's opinion. The 600 years between the Templarism of de Maillet and that first recorded in America having yielded no documentary or other unquestionable evidence of lineal connection between the two. The first public written record of the investiture of the Masonic Order of Knights Templar is dated August 28, 1769. The creation taking place in a Boston lodge. Where the ritual used on that occasion came from, or whence sprang the authority for it, is one of the many mysteries of Masonry for which no positive solution has been discovered. It is certain that the honors of the order were not bestowed upon candidates in England until 10 years after the ceremony in the Boston Lodge, although possibly in existence a few years before in Ireland. Templar Masonry immediately became popular because of its distinctive Christian character, its purpose being to perpetuate the teachings of Christ. It retains the forms and phraseology of a military organization, but the sacred nature of its rites is far different from that of a tactical system of instruction. Early in the 19th century, grand encampments of commanderies came into existence in several states of the Union, and in 1816, The General Grand Encampment of Knights Templar of the United States of America was formed in the city of New York, and since then the number of Knights Templar has multiplied until they are now to be found in almost every considerable city on the globe. Each of the individual organizations of Masons, called the Lodge, Chapter, Council, and Commandery, are under the authority of grand or general grand bodies, which legislate for and govern them by codes and constitutions. None of these bodies conflicts with another, but all work harmoniously together under an admirable and clearly defined system of independent jurisprudence. The Scottish Rite, or high-grade Masonry, is so called because the founder of its ceremonies claimed to have discovered its grades in Scotland. It was in fact originated about the middle of the 18th century in France, which for about 50 years after the introduction of symbolic Masonry into its territory was a prolific field for the production of all sorts of alleged Masonic degrees. In 1754, the Chevalier de Bonneville established in France the systematized Rite of Perfection, or heirdom, consisting of 25 degrees. The French lodges, disgusted by hundreds of bastard degrees that were floating about and distracting the attention of their members from the legitimate work, were incensed over high-grade Masonry, and in August 1766, their Grand Lodge issued an order forbidding the lodges within its jurisdiction to have anything whatever to do with any high grades. This decree was repealed, however, in October of the same year, after much quarreling and numerous brawls in the Grand Lodge, where there was a hot conflict of opinion as to the legitimacy and worth of the high grades, with which many of the disputants were unacquainted. In 1752, Frederick the Great, King of Persia, had accepted the patronage of the Scottish Rite and became its chief, immensely strengthened its influence throughout Europe. But for this fact, it is probable that the Grand Lodge of France would have remained hostile to the high grades. In 1801, the Supreme Council of the 33rd degree opened at Charleston, South Carolina, and a year after issued a circular containing a list of the 33 degrees of the Rite. 8 had been added to those of the Rite of Perfection, the 33rd and last having undoubtedly been created by the Supreme Council. It is not definitely known whether the remaining 7 were selected from degrees already in existence or the creation of the council itself. The rites of this council slowly found acceptance over the Masonic world, not being performed in England until 1845, but they are now in great favor everywhere. Its degrees in their established order, omitting the basic symbolic 3, the possession of which is necessary for the eligibility of every applicant for the Scottish Rite, are as follows: ineffable grades of Grand Lodges of Perfection. 4. Secret Master. 5. Perfect Master. 6. Intimate Secretary. 7. Provost and Judge. 8. Intendant of the Building. 9. Master-elect of 9. 10. Master-elect of 15. 11. Sublime Knight elected. 12. Grand Master Architect. 13. Knight of the Ninth Arch. 14. Grand Elect Perfect and Sublime Mason. Ancient historical and traditional grades of Grand Councils of Princes of Jerusalem. 15. Knights of the East or Sword. 16. Prince of Jerusalem. The philosophical and doctrinal grades of Grand Chapters of Rose Crux, D.H.R.D.M. 17. Knight of the East and West. 18. Sovereign Prince of Rose Crux, D.H.R.D.M. and Knight of the Eagle and Pelican. Modern historical, chivalric, and philosophical grades of Grand Consistories of Sublime Princes of the Royal Secret. 19. Grand Pontiff. 20. Grand Master ad Vitam. 21. Noachite or Persian Knight. 22. Knight of the Royal Axe, or Prince of Libanus. 23. Chief of the Tabernacle. 24. Prince of the Tabernacle. 25. Knight of the Blazing Serpent. 26. Prince of Mercy or Scotch Trinitarian. 27. Sovereign Commander of the Temple. 28. Knight of the Sun or Prince Adept. 29. Knight of St. Andrew or Patriarch of the Crusades. 30. Knight of Kadash or Knight of the White and Black Eagle. 31. Grand Inspector, Inquisitor Commander. 32. Sublime Prince of the Royal Secret. The 33rd and last degree of all is that of the official grade of the Supreme Council. 33. Sovereign Grand Inspector General. Among the characters represented in the foregoing grades are Moses, Aaron, Joshua, Eleazar, Solomon, Adoniram, Abda, Hiram, King of Tyre, Cyrus Artaxerxes, Zerubbabel, Ananias, Stokian, Zerbel, Tito Zadok, and Frederick, the King of Persia. The Scottish Rite requires so many costly accessories, such as costumes, furniture, stage scenery and properties, especially constructed buildings, underground excavations, and musical facilities, that it is practiced only in the larger cities where Masonic temples of large size exist. One of the finest Scottish Rite cathedrals in the world is at Cincinnati, Ohio, where the sublime work of high-grade masonry is exemplified in the most profoundly impressive manner by masters of the arts taught the craft. Freemasonry is now firmly established over practically the entire globe. Europe, Asia, Africa, North and South America, Australia, and all the other important islands of the sea are dotted with lodges. Almost every nation, race, and people feel its influence. As universal as the principles it inculcates, it has found nourishing soul wherever belief in the supreme being and freedom of conscience dwell together. It has given light to civilized people of every race, color, and sect that supports liberal principles, and in different jurisdictions the world over, numbers its members by scores, hundreds, or thousands, as the judgment and prudence of the craft dictate. Race prejudice exists to some extent among Freemasons, although properly it can have no place in so cosmopolitan an institution, and while it has not yet barred any race for Freemasonry, it has denied recognition in some localities to the Masonic bodies of the Negro race, and to individual Masons of the Hebraic division Semitic race. The first Negroes to be made Freemasons were Prince Hall and 14 other free-colored citizens of Boston. In 1775, the traveling lodge of a British regiment conferred the symbolic degrees upon them. They applied to England for a charter, which they received in 1787, and under its questionable authority, the first Negro Masonic Lodge was instituted, with Prince Hall as its master. In a perfectly legitimate way, its officers established another Negro Lodge in Philadelphia in 1797, and yet another at Providence soon after. In 1808, these three lodges formed a Grand Lodge, which in 1827 declared itself independent of the Grand Lodge of England, and there are now over 30 Grand Lodges of colored Freemasons in the United States, sprung from its original African lodge, which have been recognized as regular in half a dozen countries. In 1876, the Grand Lodge of Ohio refused to consider a resolution to recognize as regular the colored Grand Lodge of the same state by a vote of 399 to 332, a decision remarkable for the narrow margin by which it was made. The first Negro chapter of Royal Arch Masonry was formed in Philadelphia in 1819 or 1820. And not long after, a Negro commandery of Knights Templar was in existence. The American Negro first began to practice the Scottish Rite about 1825, but it was not until after the War of the Rebellion that much headway was made. There are now 4 Supreme Councils of Negroes in the United States, possessing very slender claims to legitimate authority. In 1895, there were 19 colored grand encampments of Knights Templar, with about 3,000 knights enrolled, whose claim to lawful origin cannot be compared with those which sustain themselves in the symbolic degrees. In Liberia, on the west coast of Africa, there has lived since 1847 a gallant little republic established by Negroes, which has a college whose professors are Negroes, and whose beneficent free institutions have at least partly civilized thousands upon thousands of Africans who dwelt on its borders. Liberia has a legitimate Grand Lodge composed of black men, with subordinate lodges in which the pure rite of the English craft is practiced by the colored race, and the principles of the order properly and judiciously disseminated. In Germany and in some localities in other countries, Jews are neither admitted to Masonic lodges nor recognized as Masons even after being made such by legitimate authority elsewhere. But these delinquencies in localities where race prejudice is strong are exceptions to the rule of tolerance which the true spirit of Freemasonry has spread nearly over the entire world and cannot justly be held against it. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Rosies. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.